The spring morning in Florence felt like any other morning in 1498, but Niccolò Machiavelli knew better. He stood in the crowded Piazza della Signoria, watching smoke rise from where Girolamo Savonarola, the religious fanatic who had controlled Florence for 4 years, was being burned at the stake. The crowd cheered. Just months ago, these same people had followed Savonarola like he was a prophet sent by God himself. Now they threw stones at his burning body. Niccolò was 29 years old, poor, unknown, and standing in a crowd of thousands. Nobody knew his name. Nobody cared about his opinions. He came from a respectable family, yes, but they had no money and even less influence. His father had been a lawyer who spent more time reading ancient Roman texts than making connections with powerful families. Young Niccolò had grown up surrounded by books about dead empires, while watching the real empire of Florence function around him, always from the outside looking in. He was thin, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to notice everything. People said he talked too much. Others said he thought too much. The wealthy families who ran Florence, the Medicis, the Strazzis, the Albazzis, they didn't even know he existed. He was just another face in the crowd, another nobody in a city full of nobodies dreaming of becoming somebody. But Niccolò had been watching. While others saw Savonarola's rise and fall as a religious drama, he saw something else. He saw how a man with no army, no money, and no noble blood had seized control of an entire city through nothing but words and timing. He saw how the same people who loved Savonarola one day wanted him dead the next. He saw that power was not what everyone pretended it was. 2 months later, something impossible happened. The new government of Florence needed someone to fill a bureaucratic position, second chancellor of the Republic. It was not a glamorous job. It was administrative work, writing letters, managing details that important men found too boring to handle themselves. The pay was terrible. The hours were long. Most men from good families would have refused it as beneath their dignity. Niccolò Machiavelli took the job immediately. His friends laughed at him. His family was disappointed. Here was a man who could read Latin and Greek, who had studied philosophy and history, taking a job as essentially a glorified clerk. But Niccolò understood something they did not. This boring, unglamorous job would put him in the room where decisions were made. He would read every diplomatic letter. He would know every secret. He would see how power actually functioned, not from books, but from the inside. For the first year, nobody took him seriously. In meetings with the government council, he would offer suggestions and watch as men 20 years older ignored him completely. They saw a young man with no money, no connections, no military experience. What could he possibly know about ruling a republic? When he spoke, they looked past him, waiting for someone important to talk. But Niccolò kept showing up. He kept taking notes. He kept watching how these powerful men made decisions. And slowly he began to notice their patterns. He saw that the men who spoke most confidently usually knew the least. He saw that the men who made the best decisions were often the ones who said the least. He saw that reputation mattered more than reality, that perception shaped outcomes more than truth. The moment everything changed came in 1499. Florence was in trouble. The city-state needed to deal with a ruthless mercenary captain named Vitellozzo Vitelli, who controlled territory Florence desperately wanted. The government council was paralyzed, arguing endlessly about what to do. Some wanted to negotiate, others wanted to fight. Everyone had opinions, but nobody wanted to make a decision because making decisions meant taking responsibility for failure. Niccolò was sent as part of a diplomatic mission. It was supposed to be routine, deliver a message, observe, report back. But when he arrived and saw the situation up close, he realized the truth. Vitelli was testing Florence. The mercenary captain was watching to see if Florence would act decisively or waste time with endless debates. Every delay made Florence look weaker. Every hesitation invited aggression. Niccolò wrote back to Florence with brutal honesty. "Stop debating," he told them. "Stop trying to be loved and respected. Vitelli does not care about your principles or your reputation for fairness. He cares about strength. Show weakness and he will attack. Show strength and he will negotiate." The council ignored his advice. They sent more diplomatic letters. They tried to reason with Vitelli. And exactly as Niccolò predicted, Vitelli attacked. Florence lost territory, lost money, and lost face. Niccolò did not say, "I told you so." Instead, he wrote another report. This one even more detailed, explaining exactly why the council's approach had failed and what should have been done differently. Something in his analysis caught the attention of Piero Soderini, who was rising in Florence's government. Unlike the other old men on the council, Soderini actually read what Niccolò wrote, and he realized this obscure clerk understood politics better than most senators. Over the next several years, Niccolò was given more responsibilities. He was sent on more diplomatic missions. He traveled to Rome, to France, to Germany. He met with princes and popes. He studied how different rulers maintained power. He took notes on everything: how they spoke, how they negotiated, what made them strong, what made them vulnerable. But he was still the poor diplomat. He traveled without servants while other ambassadors brought entire households. He wore simple clothes while others dressed in silk. At formal dinners, he was seated at the far end of the table, below merchants and bankers. The powerful families of Florence still saw him as beneath them. When he offered advice, they nodded politely and then ignored him. The mockery was subtle but constant. At government meetings, men would smile when he spoke, then talk over him. At social gatherings, conversations would stop when he approached, only to resume when he left. He was useful enough to keep around, but not important enough to respect. Niccolò endured it all. He played the part of the humble servant. He laughed at jokes made at his expense. He accepted insults with grace, and all the while he kept watching, kept learning, kept understanding how power actually worked beneath the surface of polite society. His most important mission came in 1502 when he was sent to observe Cesare Borgia, one of the most brutal and effective rulers in Italy. Borgia was the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI, and he was conquering the Romagna region through a combination of military force, political manipulation, and sheer ruthlessness. Everyone in Florence feared him. Everyone in Italy talked about him, and Niccolò was sent to watch him up close. What he saw changed everything he thought he knew about power. Borgia was not liked. He was not loved. He was barely respected. But he was feared, and that fear gave him control. Niccolò watched Borgia make promises he had no intention of keeping. He watched him betray allies when they were no longer useful. He watched him show mercy one day and extreme cruelty the next. Always calculated, always strategic. One moment stood out above all others. Borgia had conquered several territories through a particularly cruel commander named Ramiro d'Orco. D'Orco had been effective but made the people hate Borgia. So one morning, Borgia had d'Orco arrested, executed, and his body cut in half and displayed in the town square. The message was clear. Borgia was strong enough to punish even his own commanders. The people, who had hated Borgia, suddenly saw him as a just ruler who punished cruelty. Niccolò understood. Borgia had used d'Orco's cruelty to control the territory, then sacrificed him to win popular support. It was manipulation at the highest level. It was ruthless. It was effective. And it revealed a truth that all the philosophers in classical texts never taught. Successful rulers do not follow the moral rules they teach others to follow. When Niccolò returned to Florence and shared his observations, some of the council members were disgusted. This was not how virtuous men behaved, they said. Florence was a republic, not a tyranny. They governed through reason and virtue, not fear and manipulation. Niccolò said nothing in the meeting, but he wrote down everything he had learned. He began developing theories about power, not how power should work in an ideal world, but how it actually worked in the real world. He saw that successful rulers adapted to circumstances rather than sticking rigidly to principles. He saw that reputation for virtue mattered more than actual virtue. He saw that decisive action, even if cruel, often prevented worse violence later. His growing understanding came at a perfect time because Florence itself was facing an impossible situation. The city-state had been trying to reconquer Pisa, a nearby territory that had rebelled years earlier. Florence had tried everything: negotiations, paid mercenaries, diplomatic pressure. Nothing worked. The situation was becoming an embarrassment. Other Italian states were starting to see Florence as weak. Niccolò proposed a radical idea. Florence should create its own citizen militia instead of relying on expensive, unreliable mercenaries. The council thought it was absurd. Florence was a city of merchants and bankers, not warriors. Soldiers were professionals you hired, not ordinary citizens you trained. But Niccolò persisted. He argued that mercenaries had no loyalty, fought poorly, and cost too much. He argued that citizens fighting for their own city would fight harder and more reliably. He studied ancient Rome and showed how citizen armies had built an empire while mercenary armies had let it fall. Eventually, Soderini, now Florence's leader, gave Niccolo permission to try. It was seen as a gesture of pity to the enthusiastic clerk more than a serious military reform. If it succeeded, Soderini would take credit. If it failed, Niccolo would take the blame. Niccolo travelled through the Florentine countryside, recruiting farmers and craftsmen. He developed training programs. He wrote manuals. The wealthy families of Florence continued to mock him. A diplomat with no military experience was going to create an army? But in 1509, Niccolo's militia helped Florence finally retake Pisa. It was not a glorious military victory. It was grinding, difficult work. But it worked. After 15 years of failure, Florence had succeeded, and everyone knew it was because of the militia that Niccolo had created. For a brief moment, he was no longer the poor clerk. He was the man who had solved Florence's impossible problem. Important families invited him to dinners. He was consulted on military matters. His salary increased. He bought a small house. For the first time in his life, he felt like he belonged to the inner circle of Florentine power. He should have known it could not last. The year 1512 began like any other year, but Niccolo Machiavelli felt the familiar tension in Florence's political air. He had learned to read the subtle signs, the way certain families whispered in corners, the way allies suddenly became distant, the way decisions in council meetings took longer than they should. Something was shifting in the power structure. And Niccolo, despite his years of experience, despite his successes, despite everything he had learned about how power worked, did not see the danger coming for him until it was too late. For 14 years he had served Florence's Republican government. He had travelled on diplomatic missions to France, Germany, and the papal courts. He had negotiated with kings and emperors. He had created the citizen militia that finally brought Pisa back under Florentine control. He was no longer the obscure clerk from 1498. He was the second chancellor, a man whose opinions mattered, whose analysis was read, whose advice was sought by Piero Soderini himself. But political fortunes in Renaissance Italy changed as quickly as the wind. Pope Julius II had formed a holy league with Spain to drive the French out of Italy. Florence, which had allied with France, suddenly found itself on the wrong side of a war it never wanted. The Spanish army marched toward Tuscany. Florence's citizen militia, Niccolo's creation, was mobilized to defend the territory of Prato, just outside the city. Niccolo knew the militia was not ready for this. They were farmers and craftsmen trained to be soldiers, not professional warriors. They could defend walls and fight in organized formations, but they could not stand against experienced Spanish infantry in open battle. He tried to explain this to the council. He tried to suggest alternative strategies, but the council, paralyzed by fear and indecision, sent the militia to Prato anyway. The Spanish sacked Prato in August 1512. It was brutal. The militia broke and ran. Thousands of civilians were slaughtered. The Spanish troops spent 3 days pillaging, burning, and destroying. The stories that reached Florence were horrifying. Women raped, children killed, entire families executed. The city of Florence, seeing what happened to Prato, immediately surrendered without a fight. The Republican government collapsed. Piero Soderini, Niccolo's patron and protector, fled Florence in the middle of the night. And the Medici family, which had been expelled from Florence 18 years earlier, returned with Spanish military backing to reclaim control of the city. Everything changed overnight. The government Niccolo had served for 14 years no longer existed. The Medici did not return. As citizens, they returned as conquerors. They did not want a republic. They wanted absolute control. And they certainly did not want the bureaucrats and officials who had served the republic still in positions of power. Niccolo was immediately dismissed from his position. No explanation, no trial, just a simple order. You no longer work for the government of Florence. His salary stopped. His access to government buildings was revoked. His diplomatic credentials were worthless. Overnight, he went from being the second chancellor of Florence to being unemployed, middle-aged, and politically toxic. He tried to adapt. He had studied adaptation his entire career. He had watched rulers pivot from alliance to alliance, from peace to war, from mercy to cruelty, all based on changing circumstances. Surely he could apply these same principles to his own situation. He wrote letters to the Medici, offering his services. He emphasized his experience, his knowledge, his usefulness. The Medici ignored him. To them, he was a symbol of the Republican government they had overthrown. Keeping him around would send the wrong message. Besides, they had their own people, their own supporters who had waited 18 years to reclaim power. Why would they trust someone who had served their enemies? Niccolo found himself in an impossible position. He was too associated with the old government to work for the new one, but too insignificant to be worth eliminating. He existed in a political limbo, neither important enough to matter nor unimportant enough to be forgotten. Then came February 1513, and everything got worse. Two young men, Pietro Paolo Boscoli and Agostino Caponi, decided to assassinate Giuliano de' Medici. They were idealistic, angry about the fall of the Republic, and completely incompetent. They made a list of potential conspirators, people they thought might support a plot against the Medici. They did not actually recruit these people or even ask them about joining a conspiracy. They just wrote down names of men who had served the Republic. Niccolo Machiavelli's name was on that list. The conspiracy was discovered before it even really began. Boscoli and Caponi were arrested. Their list was found, and suddenly Niccolo found himself accused of plotting to assassinate the Medici, a crime punishable by death. He was arrested in his home. Guards came in the middle of the night. They did not explain the charges. They did not let him gather his things. They just took him from his family and threw him in the dungeons beneath the Palazzo Vecchio, the same building where he had worked for 14 years. The cell was dark, cold, and filled with the sounds of other prisoners. Niccolo sat in the darkness and understood with perfect clarity that he might die here. Not because he had actually done anything, but because his name appeared on a list written by fools. This was how power really worked, not through trials and evidence and justice, but through suspicion and association and the convenience of eliminating potential threats. For weeks he waited. He was questioned repeatedly. The interrogators wanted to know about the conspiracy. Niccolo told them the truth. He knew nothing about any conspiracy. He had never spoken to Boscoli or Caponi about assassinating anyone. His name was on their list without his knowledge or consent. They did not believe him. Or perhaps they believed him, but did not care. The Medici wanted to make an example. They wanted to show what happened to people associated with plots against them. So they tortured him. The method was called strappato. They tied his hands behind his back, attached the rope to a pulley, and hoisted him into the air by his arms. His full body weight pulled on his shoulder joints. The pain was beyond description. They would let him hang until he nearly passed out, then drop him suddenly, the rope catching before he hit the ground, the jolt sending new waves of agony through his body. Then they would hoist him up again. They did this 6 times. 6 times Niccolo hung in the air, his shoulders dislocating and relocating, his body screaming, his mind fragmenting. Through it all, he maintained his innocence, not because he was brave, but because there was nothing else to say. He could not confess to a conspiracy that never existed. Between torture sessions, lying on the cell floor, Niccolo thought about everything he had learned about power. He had studied Cesare Borgia. He had analyzed successful rulers throughout history. He had written reports and analysis explaining how power functioned. And now he was experiencing the reality of power from the other side, not as the observer or advisor, but as the victim. He thought about how Borgia would have handled someone like him. Borgia would have killed him immediately, not bothered with torture or trials. The most effective rulers did not hesitate. They identified threats and eliminated them cleanly. The fact that the Medici were torturing him instead of killing him meant they were uncertain. They wanted a confession, which meant they did not have real evidence. This small realization gave him hope. If they were going to kill him, they would have done it already. The torture was theater, a performance meant to scare other potential opponents. They wanted him to confess so they could justify executing him. But without a confession, killing him might create a martyr. After 3 weeks in prison, Niccolo was released. Not because he was found innocent, but because Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici was elected Pope Leo X. The Medici declared a general amnesty to celebrate this massive political victory. Niccolo walked out of prison with dislocated shoulders, bruised ribs, and a body that would hurt for the rest of his life. He was free, but he was ruined. His political career was over. His reputation was destroyed. He had no job, no income, and no prospects. The Medici made it clear he was to stay away from Florence, away from politics. away from anything that mattered. He was ordered to retire to his small farm property outside the city in Sant'Andrea, in Picosina. It was exile in everything but name. At 44 years old, Niccolò Machiavelli found himself irrelevant, forgotten, and living in poverty, on a run-down farm in the countryside. The man who had negotiated with kings now negotiated with chickens. The man who had advised republics now advised himself on how to repair fences. His days developed a miserable routine. He woke up early and checked his bird traps. He read a little, mostly just to remember what it felt like to think about something other than survival. He argued with the local woodcutters about money they owed him. He played cards in the local inn with the miller, the baker, and the butcher, men who did not know and did not care that he had once been somebody important. He was living the life he had spent his entire career trying to escape. He was nobody again, but worse than before, because now he knew exactly what he was missing. He knew what it felt like to be in the room where decisions were made. He knew the intoxication of power, even second-hand. And now it was gone, probably forever. His friends from his old life occasionally wrote to him. They told him about life in Florence, about politics, about the Medici court. Reading their letters was torture worse than the strappado because it reminded him of everything he had lost. They would mention important meetings, diplomatic missions, power struggles, all the things Niccolò understood better than almost anyone, and none of which he could participate in anymore. He wrote back to them trying to stay relevant, trying to remind them he still existed. His letters became increasingly desperate. He begged for any position, any job, any way back into political life. He emphasized his experience, his loyalty, his usefulness. He received polite responses that said nothing. The message was clear. You are history, not future. The isolation was crushing. Niccolò had spent his entire adult life surrounded by politics, engulfed in the machinery of power. Now he spent his days alone, talking to farmers about crops, dealing with tenants who could not pay rent, watching his small amount of money slowly disappear. He had a wife and children who depended on him, and he could not provide for them properly. He was a failure by every measure that mattered to him. Depression settled over him like a fog. There were days he could barely get out of bed. There were days he sat and stared at the wall, thinking about how quickly everything had fallen apart. He had been careful. He had been smart. He had studied power his entire life. And it had meant nothing. One shift in fortune, one list with his name on it, and everything he had built was destroyed. But something began to happen during those long, isolated evenings at his farm. After spending his days doing meaningless work and playing cards with peasants, Niccolò would return to his small study. He would take off his muddy, torn clothes and put on the formal robes he used to wear at court. Then he would sit at his desk and read. He read the ancient historians, Livy, Plutarch, Tacitus. He read about the Roman Republic, about how it rose and fell. He read about emperors and generals, about republics and kingdoms. And as he read, something clicked in his mind. All the things he had observed during his 14 years in government, all the patterns he had noticed, all the lessons he had learned, they matched what these ancient historians described. Power worked the same way in ancient Rome as it did in modern Florence. The same dynamics that destroyed the Roman Republic were destroying Italian city-states. The same principles that made some rulers successful and others failures applied across centuries. Niccolò had spent his career observing these patterns, but he had never organized his observations into a coherent theory. Now, with nothing but time, he began to write. Not diplomatic reports for a government that no longer wanted him. Not analysis for patrons who had abandoned him. He wrote for himself, trying to make sense of everything he had seen and experienced. He started with a treatise he called Discourses on Livy, analyzing the Roman historian's work through the lens of practical politics. As he wrote, he found clarity. All his frustrations, all his observations, all the truths he could never say out loud in government meetings, they poured onto the page. He wrote about how republics functioned, how they maintained liberty, how they inevitably declined. He wrote about the tensions between the common people and the elite, and how that tension could be productive or destructive. He wrote about military matters, about diplomacy, about the countless small details that determined whether a state succeeded or failed. But the real revelation came when he decided to write something different, something shorter, more focused, a handbook of sorts, analyzing political power from the perspective of a prince, a single ruler trying to acquire and maintain control. He would write the book he wished he could have given to every ruler he had advised. the book that said out loud all the things everyone knew but nobody admitted. He called it Il Principe, the Prince. Niccolò Machiavelli wrote in a fury during the winter of 1513, his candle burning late into the night while his family slept. The farmhouse was cold, draughty, and quiet except for the scratch of his pen on paper. He wrote like a man possessed, not because he expected anyone to read what he was writing, but because after years of keeping silent, of watching fools make terrible decisions, of knowing the truth but never being allowed to speak it, he finally had nothing left to lose. The Prince began as a fairly standard political treatise. Every educated man in Italy had read classical texts about ideal rulers and perfect governments. They talked about virtue, justice, and moral leadership. They described how princes should behave if the world was good and people were honest. Niccolò had read all these books. He had even believed them once, back when he was young and naive. But then, he had spent 14 years watching how power actually worked. He had seen virtuous men destroyed and ruthless men prosper. He had watched principled leaders lose everything while cunning manipulators gained control. He had observed that the rulers everyone called successful had broken every rule that philosophers said good rulers should follow. So Niccolò made a decision that would echo through history. He would write the truth. Not the truth people wanted to hear, not the truth that sounded noble and virtuous, but the truth about how political power actually functioned in the real world. He wrote that rulers must learn to be both fox and lion, clever enough to recognize traps and fierce enough to frighten enemies. He wrote that it is safer to be feared than loved because fear is more reliable than affection. He wrote that rulers must know how to break their word when keeping promises would harm them. He wrote that appearing virtuous matters more than being virtuous. Every word he wrote violated the accepted wisdom of his time, but he backed up every claim with examples from history and from his own observations. When he said fear was more effective than love, he pointed to Cesare Borgia and explained exactly how Borgia had used calculated cruelty to maintain control. When he said rulers must learn when not to be good, he showed how morally rigid leaders had been destroyed by more flexible opponents. The book was not very long, only about 26 chapters, but it was dense with insights that Niccolò had accumulated over a lifetime of observation. He wrote about when to give gifts and when to show cruelty, about how to keep the loyalty of soldiers, about why mercenaries would always fail you, about how to take a city without destroying its goodwill, about managing advisors, about avoiding flattery. He wrote with brutal honesty. Everyone sees what you appear to be, he wrote. Few experience what you really are. He explained that successful rulers create a public image of virtue while privately doing whatever is necessary to maintain power. He argued that idealism in politics gets you killed, while pragmatic ruthlessness keeps you alive. The most controversial section came when Niccolò addressed the question of whether it was better to be loved or feared. His answer shocked anyone who read it. Better to be feared, but never hated. It was reliable. People feared punishment, feared loss, feared death. But love was fickle. People loved you when it benefited them and abandoned you when it did not. A ruler depending on love would be disappointed. A ruler who cultivated fear while avoiding hatred would survive. Niccolò did not write these things because he was a cynic who had given up on humanity. He wrote them because he had watched too many good people fail, and too many corrupt people succeed to believe that virtue alone determined outcomes. He had watched Florence's Republic, which tried to govern justly and morally, get destroyed by the Medici, who governed pragmatically and ruthlessly. He had watched idealistic leaders make terrible decisions while insisting they were following principles. He finished The Prince in December 1513, just months after his release from prison. He had a manuscript. But what now? Books needed patrons, needed publishers, needed audiences. Niccolò had none of these things. He was a disgraced former bureaucrat living in exile. Who would care about his political theories? He decided to dedicate The Prince to Giuliano de' Medici, the same man the failed conspirators had supposedly planned to assassinate. It was a desperate move. Niccolò hoped that if a Medici actually read the book, they would recognize his value and give him another chance at political employment. He wrote a dedication explaining that he was offering the greatest gift he could give: knowledge accumulated through years of experience and study. He sent the manuscript to Florence and waited for a response. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. No response came. The Medici apparently received his book and did not care enough even to acknowledge it. To them, it was just another treatise from another former bureaucrat trying to get back into politics. Niccolò felt the rejection like physical pain. His masterwork, the book that contained everything he had learned about power, had been ignored by the very people who could have benefited from it most. He had poured his soul onto those pages, had written truths that nobody else dared to write, and it had been dismissed as irrelevant. He continued writing, not because he had hope, but because writing was all he had left. He worked on his discourses on Livy, expanding his analysis of republics and political structures. He wrote plays, including a comedy called La Mandragola, that became popular in Florence. He wrote poetry. He wrote anything that might keep his mind active and his name remembered. But The Prince remained unpublished. Niccolò showed it to friends, who read it with a mixture of fascination and horror. Some told him it was brilliant. Others told him it was dangerous. Everyone agreed it could never be published. It was too honest, too brutal, too likely to get him in more trouble with the authorities. Years passed. Niccolò remained on his farm, writing, hoping, slowly accepting that his political career was truly over. He was invited back to Florence occasionally for intellectual gatherings, where educated men discussed philosophy and politics. At these meetings, people treated him with a kind of nostalgic respect. He was the old diplomat, interesting to talk to, full of stories from the past, but ultimately irrelevant to the present. In 1519, a small opportunity appeared. The Medici Pope Leo X commissioned Niccolò to write a history of Florence. It was not the political position he wanted, but it was something. It was acknowledgement that he still existed, that his knowledge had value. He threw himself into the project, spending years researching and writing a comprehensive history of his city. During this time, he occasionally pulled out The Prince and reread it. Sometimes he added notes or made small revisions, but mostly he just sat with what he had written, knowing it was his best work and might never be read by anyone who mattered. Then, in 1520, something shifted. The Medici regime was becoming more established, less paranoid about threats from the old republic. Niccolò, now 50 years old, was gradually allowed back into minor political circles. He was given some small diplomatic assignments. Nothing like his old position, but enough to feel like he was part of the political world again. He delivered the history of Florence to the Medici in 1525. They paid him for the work and even gave him a few more minor commissions. It was not the triumphant return he had dreamed about, but it was better than exile on a farm. He had achieved a kind of rehabilitation, a grudging acceptance that he could be useful in small ways. But his health was failing. Years of stress, poverty, and the lingering effects of torture had taken their toll. In June 1527, at the age of 58, Niccolò Machiavelli died. He died in relative obscurity, known to some as a former diplomat and historian, but not as anyone particularly important. His great work, The Prince, was still unpublished. A few manuscript copies circulated among intellectuals, but it had not changed the world. It had changed nothing. His family prepared his modest estate. Among his papers they found The Prince, along with letters explaining how important he believed the work to be. His friends encouraged the family to publish it. In 1532, 5 years after Niccolò's death, The Prince was finally printed. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Some readers were horrified. Here was a book that told rulers to lie, to break promises, to use cruelty when necessary, to value results over principles. Critics called it evil. The Catholic Church eventually banned it. The word Machiavellian entered the language as an insult, meaning cunning, deceptive, and ruthless. But other readers recognized something different. They saw a book that finally told the truth about politics. Kings and princes read it in secret, learning strategies they would never admit to following. Diplomats studied it. Military commanders analyzed its lessons about leadership and warfare. It became the most infamous political book ever written, precisely because it said out loud what everyone knew but nobody wanted to admit. Over the centuries, The Prince's reputation only grew. Political leaders throughout history were accused of following Machiavellian principles, often accurately. The book influenced political philosophy, military strategy, and leadership theory. Niccolò's name became synonymous with political realism, with the understanding that power operates according to its own logic that often conflicts with moral idealism. Today, more than 500 years after Niccolò wrote those pages by candlelight in his cold farmhouse, The Prince is taught in universities worldwide. It has been translated into dozens of languages. It has influenced revolutionary leaders and corporate executives, generals and entrepreneurs, anyone who has ever had to make difficult decisions about power and leadership. The man who was mocked as a poor clerk, tortured as a suspected conspirator, and exiled as an irrelevant has-been became one of the most influential political thinkers in history, not because he told people what they wanted to hear, but because he told them what they needed to know. His critics were right about one thing. His book is dangerous. It is dangerous because it explains how power really works, stripping away the comfortable myths that let people pretend politics is about virtue and justice. It is dangerous because it shows that effectiveness and morality are not the same thing. It is dangerous because it arms readers with knowledge about manipulation, strategy, and the acquisition of power. But that danger is also why the book endures. Every generation rediscovers the prince and finds it relevant to their own time. The details change. We have democracies instead of principalities, corporations instead of city-states, but the underlying dynamics remain the same. Power still works the way Niccolò described it 500 years ago. The question people always ask is whether Niccolò himself was Machiavellian. Did he believe rulers should act ruthlessly? Was he advocating for tyranny? The answer is more complex than yes or no. Niccolò was describing reality, not advocating for it. He was saying, this is how power works. You can wish it worked differently, but wishing does not change reality. He had watched too many good people destroyed by refusing to accept how the world actually functioned. He had seen virtuous leaders lose to corrupt ones because the virtuous leaders played by rules that their opponents ignored. He wrote The Prince not because he wanted a world where ruthlessness prevailed, but because he lived in such a world and thought people should understand it. His personal life suggests he was not the amoral manipulator his book might suggest. He was loyal to friends even when it cost him. He loved his family. He believed deeply in Republican government and wrote extensive works analyzing how republics could maintain liberty. He was capable of empathy, of humor, of genuine human connection. But he also understood that private virtue and public effectiveness were different things. A person could be kind to friends and ruthless to enemies. A person could value justice in personal relationships while recognizing that political relationships operated differently. The mistake most people made, Niccolò believed, was assuming that what worked in private morality would work in political power. The greatest irony of Niccolò Machiavelli's life is that he never gained the power he understood so well. He spent his life studying power from the outside, advising others, analyzing strategies, but never actually ruling. He was the permanent advisor, the eternal number two, the man who understood the game but never got to play it at the highest level. Yet this outsider status might be exactly why he saw so clearly. People immersed in power often cannot see its patterns because they are too close, too invested, too convinced of their own importance. Niccolò maintained the perspective of someone who had been close enough to see everything but distant enough to remain objective. He had experienced both sides of power, the intoxication of being in the room where decisions were made and the agony of being powerless. He knew what it felt like to advise princes and to be imprisoned by them. He had studied power from every angle, as a diplomat, as a military organizer, as a political theorist, as a victim, and finally as an exiled observer with nothing left to lose. That comprehensive perspective is what made The Prince timeless. Niccolò did not write from ideology or abstract theory. He wrote from direct observation of how power actually functioned, combined with historical analysis showing these same patterns across centuries. He connected the practical present to the theoretical past, and created something that transcended both. The ultimate measure of Niccolò Machiavelli's legacy is not what he achieved during his life. Modest diplomatic posts, one successful military reform, historical writing, plays that were briefly popular. His legacy is the ideas that survived him. 500 years after his death, people still argue about whether his insights were brilliant or evil, whether he was a realist or a cynic, whether his book is a manual for tyranny or simply an honest description of political reality. The fact that these arguments continue proves that Niccolò succeeded in his deepest goal. He was terrified of being forgotten, of becoming another obscure bureaucrat lost to history. Instead, he became immortal. His name is known to every educated person on earth. His book has never gone out of print. His ideas continue to provoke, to enlighten, and to disturb. He was ridiculed by his contemporaries, imprisoned and tortured by his city, exiled to poverty and irrelevance. But in the end, he had the last word. Everyone who mocked him is forgotten. Everyone who dismissed him has disappeared into history. But Niccolo Machiavelli's words still echo through every corridor of power, every political calculation, every moment when someone has to choose between what is right and what is effective. He lost every battle during his lifetime, and he won the war that mattered. The war for lasting influence, for ideas that could not be killed, for a legacy that could not be destroyed no matter how much his body was broken or his reputation attacked. They tried to silence him with exile. They tried to break him with torture. They tried to erase him with indifference. They failed completely. Today, when corporate executives strategize about competition, when political leaders calculate their moves, when anyone in any field thinks about power and how to acquire or maintain it, they are walking paths that Niccolo Machiavelli mapped 500 years ago. His voice speaks from those cold nights in the farmhouse, from the prison cell where he was tortured, from every moment of humiliation and defeat he endured. His message is simple but eternal. Power is real. It operates according to specific principles, and understanding those principles is the first step toward either wielding power or defending yourself against those who do. You can condemn those principles as immoral. You can wish the world worked differently, but you cannot escape the reality he described. From ridicule to rule, Niccolo never truly ruled anything during his life, but his ideas rule still, shaping how we think about politics, leadership, strategy, and power. He turned his defeat into victory, his exile into influence, his torture into teaching. He proved that the most dangerous weapon is not the sword or the prison, but the idea that refuses to die. And that is how a broken, exiled, dismissed former bureaucrat became one of the most influential minds in human history.